The avoidant becomes obsessed with the super empath because, often for the first time in their life, they experience a form of emotional connection that bypasses their usual defenses. The super empath does not simply offer affection, they offer emotional recognition. They sense the pain beneath the silence, the fear beneath the distance, and the longing hidden behind emotional control. To someone who has spent years surviving through detachment, that kind of understanding feels almost impossible to resist. It feels like finally being emotionally visible without having to explain every wound. But this is also exactly why the connection becomes so destabilizing for the avoidant. The super empath does not just make them feel loved, they make them feel emotionally exposed. And for someone whose nervous system equates vulnerability with danger, exposure creates conflict.
One part of them wants to move closer because the connection feels rare, comforting, and deeply validating. Another part wants to escape because closeness activates fear, responsibility, and the possibility of emotional dependence. So they become trapped between attraction and self-protection. This creates the painful push-pull dynamic so many empaths experience. The avoidant reaches for connection when they feel lonely, emotionally starved, or overwhelmed by the absence of the empath's warmth. But the moment intimacy becomes real again, fear resurfaces. Suddenly, the relationship no longer feels comforting. It feels emotionally demanding. Not because the empath is doing something wrong, but because genuine closeness requires emotional openness, consistency, and vulnerability, all things the avoidant has learned to fear. What makes the super empath different from others is not just their depth of feeling. It is their ability to love without abandoning themselves. The sovereign empath does not chase endlessly. They do not collapse into desperation every time the avoidant withdraws. They feel the pain deeply, but they return inward instead of losing themselves in pursuit. That emotional groundedness changes the entire dynamic because the avoidant can no longer rely on the usual cycle where withdrawal creates chasing, and chasing restores their sense of control. Instead, they encounter someone who sees them clearly without trying to force them to change. Someone who understands their wounds without excusing harmful behavior. Someone capable of profound compassion while still holding boundaries. And that combination unsettles the avoidant more than anything else because it removes the familiar relational scripts they have relied on their entire life. But the most important truth in all of this is that understanding an avoidant's internal struggle does not change the external reality of the relationship. They may think about you constantly. They may miss you deeply. They may feel emotionally connected to you for years. But feelings alone do not create healthy love. Internal conflict is not the same as emotional readiness. Longing is not the same as commitment. And obsession is not the same as devotion. A relationship cannot survive on unspoken emotion alone. It requires visible effort, accountability, consistency, and the willingness to move toward connection instead of retreating from it whenever vulnerability appears. Without that, the relationship remains emotionally incomplete no matter how strong the feelings underneath may be. So the final lesson is this. Your value was never determined by someone's inability to meet you emotionally. The avoidance withdrawal is not proof that you were too much, too emotional, or too loving. More often, it reflects the limits of their current emotional capacity. And while empathy allows you to understand those limits, self-respect reminds you not to build your life around waiting for someone else to overcome them. Real love is not measured by how deeply someone feels in silence. It is measured by what they are willing to consistently do with those feelings in reality. The avoidant may crave love deeply, but craving love is not the same as being emotionally available for it. This is the painful contradiction at the center of the connection between the avoidant and the super empath. One person brings openness, emotional depth, and willingness to connect. The other brings longing mixed with fear, desire mixed with withdrawal, and closeness mixed with self-protection. And no matter how powerful the chemistry feels, relationships cannot survive on emotional intensity alone. The super empath often becomes the emotional center of the relationship. They carry the conversations, the understanding, the patience, the forgiveness, and the emotional awareness for both people. They learn the avoidance wounds, recognize their patterns, and continuously try to love them in ways that feel safe and non-threatening. But over time, something exhausting happens. The empath begins to realize that they are constantly adjusting while the avoidant remains emotionally guarded. The relationship slowly becomes less about mutual connection and more about emotional management. This is why the avoidant becomes so attached to the super empath's presence. The empath creates a kind of emotional sanctuary they have rarely experienced elsewhere. They feel accepted without judgment, understood without having to explain every fear, and emotionally held without pressure. But because the avoidant has not learned how to internally regulate intimacy, they begin relying on the empath's emotional steadiness instead of developing their own. The empath becomes their emotional safe place while they remain emotionally inconsistent in return. That is why breadcrumbing and hovering become so common. The avoidant wants access to the emotional comfort without fully surrendering to the vulnerability real intimacy requires. They stay close enough to feel connected but distant enough to feel safe. They give small pieces of affection to calm their loneliness, but they rarely sustain the emotional presence necessary to build trust and stability. And because the super empath naturally searches for emotional meaning, they often interpret those brief moments of closeness as proof that deeper change is happening. But intermittent connection is not the same as emotional readiness. Occasional vulnerability is not the same as consistent intimacy. Someone can miss you, think about you constantly, feel emotionally attached to you, and still be unable to build a healthy relationship with you. That is one of the hardest truths for the empath to accept, because they tend to measure love through emotional depth, while healthy relationships are actually sustained through emotional consistency. Eventually, the super empath reaches a turning point. They begin to understand that empathy without boundaries becomes self-erasure. They realize they have been carrying the emotional weight of the relationship while hoping the avoidant would someday grow into the connection fully. And when that realization settles in deeply enough, their energy changes. They stop chasing emotional potential. They stop trying to decode mixed signals. They stop treating inconsistency as hidden love. What makes this shift so powerful is that it is not fueled by anger. It comes from clarity. The super empath finally recognizes that love should not require abandoning themselves emotionally. They understand that compassion for someone's wounds does not obligate them to tolerate emotional unavailability forever. And for the avoidant, this moment feels shocking because they often assume the empath's patience was endless. When the super empath walks away with calm certainty instead of emotional chaos, the avoidant is forced to confront something they spent the entire relationship avoiding: the reality of loss. Not imagined loss, not controlled distance, but real absence. And often, that is the first time they fully feel the emotional weight of what the relationship actually meant. But even then, the deepest lesson remains the same. Love alone is not enough when only one person is emotionally available. A relationship cannot survive on one person's willingness to understand, while the other remains trapped in cycles of fear and retreat. Emotional connection only becomes healthy when both people are willing to participate consistently, communicate honestly, and stay present even when intimacy feels uncomfortable. The super empath's greatest strength is not their ability to endlessly heal others. It is their ability to finally choose themselves without losing their compassion. Because real love is not proven by how much pain you can tolerate for someone. Real love is proven by mutual effort, emotional responsibility, and the courage to meet each other fully instead of hiding behind fear. The deepest tragedy in the avoidant super empath dynamic is that both people often genuinely care, yet care alone cannot overcome emotional unavailability. The avoidant may feel intense attachment, longing, even obsession, but unless those feelings are transformed into consistent emotional presence, the relationship slowly collapses under the weight of imbalance. Meanwhile, the super empath continues trying to love harder, understand deeper, and remain patient longer, believing that enough warmth will eventually melt the avoidance defenses. But love cannot heal someone who is still committed to emotional escape. The avoidance shutdown is not usually cruelty in the deliberate sense. It is fear-based self-protection. When intimacy deepens, their nervous system interprets closeness as emotional risk. vulnerability begins to feel overwhelming. So instead of leaning into communication, repair, and emotional openness, they retreat into silence, distance, or inconsistency. The closer the relationship becomes, the more exposed they feel internally. And because they have not yet developed the capacity to regulate that emotional exposure in healthy ways, they sabotage the very connection they secretly crave. The super empath responds in the opposite direction. They move closer when things feel uncertain. They offer reassurance, patience, emotional safety, and understanding. They try to become the calm place where the avoidant can finally rest their fears. But over time, this creates an exhausting imbalance where one person becomes responsible for maintaining the emotional life of the relationship, while the other repeatedly withdraws from it. The empath mistakes emotional intensity for emotional progress, holding on to the brief moments where the avoidant opens up and hoping those moments will eventually become permanent. But isolated moments of vulnerability are not the same as emotional consistency. That is the painful lesson at the center of this dynamic. Potential is not partnership. Tender moments do not automatically become stable love. A healthy relationship is not built from rare flashes of closeness. It is built from repeated behaviors, communication, accountability, reliability, and emotional presence over time. If someone's dominant pattern is withdrawal, silence, avoidance, or fear-based distancing, then those behaviors become the actual emotional reality of the relationship, no matter how deep the feelings underneath may be. This is why healing becomes essential. The avoidant must eventually choose to confront their fear of vulnerability rather than organize their entire emotional life around avoiding it. They have to stop outsourcing emotional labor onto the empath's patience and begin developing the ability to stay emotionally present during discomfort. No amount of unconditional love can make that decision for them. Emotional availability cannot be borrowed from another person. It has to be built internally through self-awareness, accountability, and genuine emotional work. For the super empath, the transformation is different but equally important. They must learn that empathy without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. They must recognize that understanding someone's wounds does not obligate them to endlessly tolerate inconsistency, emotional absence, or repeated disappointment. The super empath's greatest strength is not their ability to rescue emotionally unavailable people. It is their ability to remain compassionate without sacrificing themselves in the process. And this is ultimately where clarity replaces confusion. The avoidant is not necessarily heartless. The super empath is not too emotional or too intense. The connection between them is often real, profound, and emotionally transformative for both people. But transformation alone does not guarantee compatibility. Emotional chemistry does not automatically create emotional safety. Obsession does not equal commitment. Longing does not equal readiness. Real love requires two people who are both willing to stay emotionally present when things become difficult. It requires mutual effort, not one person carrying the emotional weight for both. It requires the courage to communicate honestly instead of disappearing into fear whenever intimacy deepens. So the final truth is simple, even if it hurts. You can deeply love someone and still be unable to build a healthy life with them. And if a relationship repeatedly asks you to shrink your needs, question your worth, or survive on emotional breadcrumbs while waiting for someone else to become ready, then love is no longer nourishing you. It is slowly consuming you. The super empath's path is not learning how to love less. It is learning how to love without abandoning themselves. Because the healthiest form of love will never require you to betray your own emotional well-being in order to keep someone else close. What this entire journey ultimately reveals is that the connection between the avoidant and the super empath is not shallow, imaginary, or meaningless. In many cases, it is one of the most emotionally intense and psychologically transformative relationships both people will ever experience. The avoidant feels deeply seen in ways they have likely never experienced before, while the super empath feels emotionally bonded through the depth, complexity, and vulnerability hidden beneath the avoidance walls. The connection can feel rare, magnetic, almost fated. But intensity alone is not enough to sustain love. Emotional depth without emotional consistency eventually turns into emotional exhaustion. The avoidant is not emotionless. Beneath the distance, silence, withdrawal, and contradictions often exists a person carrying enormous fear around intimacy, vulnerability, responsibility, and emotional exposure. They may crave connection more than they can admit. They may miss the empath constantly, replay conversations in their mind, think about the relationship long after it ends, and quietly carry unresolved feelings for years. But their internal experience and their external behavior often exist in two completely different worlds. They can feel love deeply while still being unable to express it in stable, healthy, or reliable ways. And that is the central tragedy of avoidance. The problem is rarely the absence of feeling. The problem is the inability to consistently remain emotionally present when those feelings become real. The super empath enters this dynamic with extraordinary emotional openness. They bring patience, understanding, warmth, intuition, and a rare ability to see beneath emotional defenses without immediately judging what they find there. They notice the wounds beneath the withdrawal. They understand the fear beneath the silence. They sense the longing hidden beneath emotional distance. And because of that sensitivity, they often become the one person capable of reaching parts of the avoidant that no one else ever has. That experience changes the avoidant profoundly because being fully seen without rejection feels both healing and terrifying at the same time. But this is where the relationship becomes dangerous for the empath if boundaries are missing. The empath often mistakes emotional depth for emotional readiness. They hold on to the brief moments when the avoidant opens up, becomes vulnerable, expresses tenderness, or reaches toward closeness. Those moments feel so real, so emotionally significant, that the empath begins believing consistency is only one breakthrough away. They start loving not only who the avoidant is, but who they could become if they finally healed enough to stay emotionally available. And this is where many super empaths slowly lose themselves. They begin carrying the emotional weight of the relationship almost entirely alone. They become the stabilizer, the communicator, the forgiver, the emotional translator, the one constantly trying to create safety for both people. Every withdrawal from the avoidant is answered with more understanding. Every silence is met with more patience. Every breadcrumb is interpreted as hidden love trying to emerge. But over time, the relationship becomes less about mutual partnership and more about emotional survival. The avoidant, meanwhile, often becomes attached not just to the empath as a person, but to the emotional regulation the empath provides. The empath becomes their emotional refuge, their source of warmth, validation, understanding, and safety. But because the avoidant has not yet learned how to internally sustain emotional closeness without fear, they continue oscillating between longing and retreat. They crave intimacy until intimacy actually arrives. Then fear activates, vulnerability feels dangerous again, and distance becomes their way of restoring emotional control. This creates the exhausting cycle described throughout the speech. The breadcrumbing, the hovering, the mixed signals, the indirect communication, the silent monitoring, the emotional pull followed by withdrawal. None of it necessarily means the avoidant does not care. In many cases, they care deeply. But caring and showing up are not the same thing. Missing someone is not the same thing as building a relationship with them. Internal longing does not automatically translate into emotional responsibility, accountability, or consistency. That distinction becomes one of the most important truths the super empath must eventually face. You cannot build a healthy relationship around someone's hidden feelings, unspoken emotions, or internal conflict. Relationships are built through behavior, through communication, through reliability, through the willingness to remain emotionally present even when fear, discomfort, vulnerability, or conflict appear. Love that only exists privately inside someone, while their actions repeatedly create instability, cannot create emotional security for another person. And perhaps the most painful realization is this: the avoidance withdrawal was never proof that the empath was too much. The empath was not too emotional, too loving, too deep, or too caring, or too In fact, what overwhelmed the avoidant was often the exact thing that made the connection extraordinary. The empath's ability to love authentically, see clearly, and remain emotionally open without pretending intimacy was something casual or superficial. The avoidant was not retreating because the empath lacked value. They were retreating because real closeness activated fears they did not yet know how to handle. But understanding someone's wounds does not obligate you to endlessly tolerate the consequences of those wounds. Compassion is important, but compassion without boundaries becomes self-erasure. Empathy without self-protection becomes emotional self-sacrifice. And many super empaths eventually realize that they spent years trying to prove their love to someone who is emotionally incapable of consistently receiving it in healthy ways. That realization marks the turning point. The super empath stops trying to rescue, stops waiting for potential, stops interpreting inconsistency as hidden devotion, stops shrinking their needs to accommodate someone else's fear of intimacy, and instead, they begin returning their emotional energy back toward themselves. Not through bitterness or resentment, but through clarity. Because real love was never meant to require abandoning yourself in order to keep someone else comfortable. Real love is mutual. It is emotionally available. It is grounded in consistency, accountability, openness, and shared effort. It is not one person endlessly carrying the emotional labor while the other remains trapped in cycles of fear and withdrawal. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all. The avoidant and the super empath often meet in order to expose each other's deepest wounds and deepest growth. The avoidant is forced to confront the emotional walls they built to survive. The super empath is forced to confront the ways they abandoned themselves in the hope of saving others. Both people are transformed by the connection, but transformation alone does not guarantee they can build a healthy life together. At some point, reality must matter more than potential. Patterns must matter more than promises. Actions must matter more than hidden feelings. And if someone repeatedly chooses distance over vulnerability, silence over communication, and emotional safety over emotional growth, then no amount of love from another person can create the relationship they are not yet capable of sustaining. So the final truth of this entire speech is not cynical, it is clarifying. Love is not measured by how intensely someone feels in silence. Love is measured by what they are consistently willing to do with those feelings. It is measured by presence, emotional courage, honesty, accountability, and the willingness to stay connected even when intimacy becomes uncomfortable. The super empath's greatest power was never the ability to endlessly heal emotionally unavailable people. Their greatest power is the moment they finally realize they deserve a love that does not require constant emotional survival to maintain. A love where they are not merely understood in private or missed from a distance, but actively chosen, valued, protected, and met fully in reality. Because true love will never ask you to shrink your heart, betray your boundaries, or survive on emotional breadcrumbs while waiting for someone else to become ready. True love meets you openly, consistently, and courageously. And anything less, no matter how intense it feels, will eventually leave you carrying the weight of two hearts while slowly losing connection to your own.